The cold seeped through the thin soles of Alba's shoes, a chilling dampness that climbed from the stone steps into her small 6-year-old body. Her mother's hand was a cage of trembling fingers around her own, tight and unfamiliar. Elena's face was a pale mask in the fading light, her eyes avoiding the very thing that made Alba unique. One a deep, warm honey, the other a piercing sky blue. The little girl didn't understand the strange, heavy silence that had fallen between them on the long bus ride to the city. She only knew that her mother's scent of lavender and sorrow was thick in the air, and the worn, cardboard suitcase by her feet felt heavier than all the toys she'd ever owned. It was a finality she could feel but not name. Her mother knelt, her knees cracking on the unforgiving stone. "You'll be safe here, little bird," Eleanor whispered, her voice a splintered thing. The words were meant to be a comfort, but they landed like stones. Alba's mismatched eyes, wide with confusion, searched her mother's face for an answer, for a sign that this was just a game. She saw only fear, a deep, raw terror that wasn't for her, but of her. Alba's small arms wrapped around her mother's waist, clinging to the familiar wool of her coat, but there was no embrace in return. Instead, her mother's hands pried her fingers away, one by one, a slow, agonizing separation. "What have you done to make your own mother afraid of you?" Then she was gone. Elena stood, turned, and walked away without a single look back. Her hurried footsteps echoed against the tall, silent buildings, each click on the pavement a nail in the coffin of Alba's childhood. The little girl stood frozen, her world shrinking to the fading silhouette of the only person she had ever loved. The city air, thick with the smells of rain and exhaust, felt suddenly suffocating. She was an island in a sea of indifference. The handle of the suitcase was slick and cold in her palm. The silence that followed was louder than any scream, a vast, empty space where a mother's love used to be. Have you ever felt a silence so loud it breaks your heart? The shock was a layer of ice over her skin, preserving the moment in perfect, horrifying detail. She didn't scream or cry. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. A single, childlike thought looped in her mind. What did I do wrong? Her small hand instinctively went to her face, her fingertips tracing the delicate skin around her eyes. The honey one, the blue one, the ones the village children called witch eyes, the ones the adults whispered about after her father got sick. For the first time, she didn't see them as colors. She felt them as a curse, a stain. The reason for the whispers, the reason for the fear in her mother's face, the reason she was now standing alone on the steps of a coldy grey building. The colossal wooden door of the Mercy House orphanage groaned open, revealing a stern, shadowy figure. A woman in a drab habit looked down, her gaze clinical, sweeping over the small girl and the shabby suitcase with an air of weary resignation. There was no kindness there, only duty. Alba looked up, her unique eyes, one of earth, one of sky, reflecting the last glimmers of twilight. They held a silent plea, a question that would go unanswered for more than a decade. The world had just taught her that love was not a right, but a privilege that could be revoked without warning. She was rejected by the one who should have loved her most. But was she to blame for being different? Elena did not cry on the bus ride back. Tears would have been a relief, a cleansing rain. But her grief was a dry, barren desert. The seat beside her, once occupied by a small warm body, was now a cavernous void. In the grimy window she saw not the passing fields of her homeland, but the reflection of a stranger, a woman with haunted eyes and a mouth set in a hard, brittle line. She had severed a part of her own soul and left it on those cold city steps. She told herself it was for Alba's good, a desperate surgery to cut out the poison of their village's judgment. But as the bus rattled on, each bump in the road felt like a judgment from the earth itself. What is the heaviest thing you've ever had to carry? For Elena, it was the silence where her daughter's laughter used to be. The whispers had started subtly, like the rustling of dry leaves, after her husband's fever took him. A bad harvest, a sick cow, a sudden death. The village needed a reason, a target for its fear. And there was Alba, with her eyes of earth and sky. A beautiful anomaly they twisted into an omen. Old Man Hemlock stopped tipping his hat. Women would cross the street, pulling their own children closer, their lips moving in silent, sharp-edged prayers. The stares were not just curious, they were accusations. Elena felt them like stones thrown at her back every time she went to the market. She was a young widow, already an outsider, and her daughter's unique beauty had become the brand that marked them both for exile. Could you stand against an entire town when its fear is pointed at your child? In the hollow quiet of her home, Elena began to weave a terrible lie, a story she told herself over and over until it felt like the truth. She wasn't abandoning her daughter, she was saving her. In the city, no one would know their story. No one would whisper about curses. Alba could grow up normal, free from the shadow of her own eyes. Elena imagined a new life for her, a life without the constant, suffocating weight of prejudice. This twisted act of self-preservation masqueraded as a mother's sacrifice. She convinced herself that this profound act of cruelty was, in fact, the greatest act of love she could offer. But is it still love when it breaks the very heart you claim to be protecting? But peace never came. The silence she had craved became a roaring torment. Her small house, once filled with Alba's quiet humming, was now a tomb. The lavender she grew in the garden withered from neglect, its scent replaced by the stale air of regret. She stopped looking in mirrors, terrified of the face that stared back, the face of a monster who had traded her child for the approval of people she didn't even like. The isolation she had feared for them both, she now endured alone. She had run from the judgment of the village, only to find a harsher judge living inside her own skin. She had built a prison of fear and, in the end, locked herself inside it. She packed away Alba's things into the small cardboard suitcase, a futile attempt to bury the past. A half-finished drawing of a lopsided house, a smooth stone Alba had found by the creek, a tiny sweater Elena had knitted. Each object was a ghost. She hid the box in the attic, but the memories refused to be contained. A patch of blue sky seen through the window, the color of honey dripping from a spoon, everything was a reminder. The pain was no longer a sharp, immediate terror, but a dull, constant ache that settled deep in her bones. A part of her had died on those steps, and she knew it. Have you ever tried to erase a memory, only to find it carved into your very soul? Years bled into one another, each one a little grayer than the last. Elena became a ghost in her own life, a silent figure moving through the village that had once terrified her. The whispers had long since faded, replaced by a pity that felt even worse. One spring afternoon, she saw a young mother in the market square, patiently untangling a knot from her daughter's hair. The simple, unconscious tenderness of the act struck Elena with the force of a physical blow. It was a language of love she had forgotten how to speak. In that moment, the lie she had built her life upon finally crumbled to dust, revealing the ugly truth beneath. She hadn't saved her daughter from a curse. She had become one. The Mercy House orphanage was not a home. It was a machine for processing forgotten children. Its air smelled of bleach, boiled cabbage, and a faint, underlying scent of sorrow. The long grey hallways echoed with the shuffling of worn-out shoes and the clipped, tired voices of the nuns who ran the place. On her first night, Alba lay on a cot with a mattress as thin as a memory, a single scratchy blanket pulled up to her chin. The cold of the stone floor seemed to rise through the metal frame, seeping into her bones. She wasn't Alba anymore. She was a number, a cot in a row, a mouth to feed. If you had seen that small girl shivering in the dark, what would you have done? The other children, sharp-eyed and hardened by their own losses, quickly found her difference. "Odd eyes," one boy sneered, pointing. "The little witch," a girl whispered. Pulling her friends away, they treated her uniqueness like a contagion. Alba learned to walk with her head down, her dark hair falling like a curtain to hide her face. She made herself small, quiet, invisible. She would sit alone in the bleak courtyard, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick, while the sounds of other children's games felt like they were happening in another world. Have you ever felt so alone that even the noise of laughter feels like a punishment? She learned that silence was her only shield. Survival became a routine of enduring. Mornings were a shock of cold water and a bowl of watery oatmeal. Lunch was a thin soup with a single, lonely piece of potato floating in it. Dinner was a slice of stale bread that she had to chew for a long time to soften. Hunger was a constant, dull ache in her belly, a hollow feeling that no amount of food ever seemed to fill. She'd watch the nuns eat their warm, hearty meals in a separate room, the smell of roasted meat drifting down the hall. a cruel reminder of a world of comfort she couldn't access. The emptiness inside her was more than just hunger. It was a craving for a warmth that bread could never provide. The greatest cruelty of Mercy House was not the physical hardship, but the profound absence of touch. A hand on her shoulder was only ever to push her into line. A voice that called her name was only ever to issue a command. No one ever knelt to look her in the eyes. No one smoothed her hair. No one offered the simple, life-affirming gesture of a hug. She would watch younger children cry for their mothers until their voices were hoarse, only to be met with a sigh of irritation. Alba stopped crying. She learned that her tears were worthless here. What is worse for a child, an angry shout, or the cold, hard silence of indifference? Her own reflection became her enemy. In the grimy bathroom mirror or a rain puddle in the yard, she would catch a glimpse of her eyes. One honey, one sky, and a wave of shame would wash over her. These were the eyes that had made her mother afraid. This was the flaw, the curse, the reason she was here. She began to believe the whispers of the village, the taunts of the other children. She was broken. She was wrong. At night, she would press her palms against her eyelids, trying to push the colors away, as if she could physically erase the part of herself that made her unlovable. The only thing she had left of her mother was a small mother-of-pearl button, which had snagged on her sleeve and torn from Eleanor's coat during their last, desperate struggle. She kept it hidden in the hem of her uniform, a secret sacred relic. At night, she would take it out and hold it in her small palm, its smooth, cool surface a phantom touch from a forgotten life. It was a symbol of everything she had lost: the scent of lavender, the warmth of a kitchen, the sound of her name spoken with love. This tiny object was her entire world, a painful reminder that she was once loved, and a constant question of why that love had ended. Holidays were the sharpest razors. On Christmas morning, the orphanage would fill with the forced cheer of charity. Local families would drop off second-hand toys and bags of candy. Children with distant relatives might receive a clumsily wrapped package. Alba never did. She would sit in a corner of the common room, watching the other children tear open their gifts. The bright colors and joyful shouts a stark contrast to the grey emptiness inside her. She was a ghost at the feast of belonging, a silent observer of a world she could see but never enter. If you could have given her one thing in that moment, what would it have been? To survive being seen. She became the one who sees. Her gaze, once lowered in shame, now became a secret tool. She learned to observe the world from the edges, noticing the details that everyone else missed. She saw the way a single beam of sunlight could illuminate a universe of dust motes dancing in the air. She noticed the intricate web a spider spun in the corner of a window pane, a masterpiece of resilience. She studied the faces of the nuns, seeing not just stern authority, but the deep lines of weariness around their eyes. Her vision, the source of her curse, was slowly, imperceptibly, becoming her only true possession. The casual cruelty of the other children was a daily lesson in powerlessness. A bigger boy once cornered her and snatched the piece of bread she had been saving, laughing as he shoved it into his mouth. She didn't fight back. She didn't even cry. She just stood there, her stomach aching, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest. She learned that to show pain was to invite more of it. Her survival depended on becoming a stone, on letting the waves of meanness wash over her without leaving a mark. But every wave took a small piece of her with it, eroding the soft child she used to be. The nights were a different kind of torment. In the vast, dark dormitory, filled with the soft sounds of sleeping, crying, and whispering children, Alba felt utterly alone. She would pull the thin blanket over her head, creating a tiny, suffocating tent, but she couldn't block out the images that haunted her. The image of her mother's back as she walked away, getting smaller and smaller until she was gone forever. That single memory played on a loop, a silent film projected onto the darkness. Sleep wasn't a refuge. It was just a continuation of the exile. Could you have found peace in that cold, lonely bed? Years bled into one another, turning her from a lost little girl into a silent, watchful child. She stood at the barred windows of the orphanage, looking out at the distant city lights. They twinkled like shattered stars, each one a life, a home, a family she would never know. Hope was a language she had forgotten how to speak. She no longer waited for someone to come for her. She had accepted her fate, to be a spectator of life, forever on the outside looking in. The world had told her she was nothing, and she had finally started to believe it. She was a ghost in her own life. Was there anyone in the world who could still truly see her? The change didn't arrive with a thunderclap, but with the quiet shuffle of old shoes on a stone floor. His name was Julian, the orphanage's elderly janitor. He was a man made of gentle silence and weary kindness, who moved through the grey hallways like a ghost of forgotten warmth. He noticed things others didn't. He saw Alba, not as the girl with the odd eyes, but as the child who would spend an entire hour watching the way rain beaded on a dirty window pane, as if it were the most beautiful art in the world. He saw her tracing the cracks in the courtyard stones, finding patterns in the chaos. He didn't see a curse in her gaze. He saw a unique way of looking. Sometimes, all a child needs is for one person to truly see them. One afternoon, as Alba sat alone, Julian approached without a word. He placed a heavy, worn object on the bench beside her. It was an old film camera, its black leatherette peeling at the edges, its metal body cool to the touch. It was from a box of donations, destined for the trash. For Julian, it was just a piece of junk. For Alba, it was a universe. She stared at it, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and wonder. No one had ever given her anything that wasn't a punishment or an afterthought. She looked up at Julian, her mismatched eyes wide with a question she didn't know how to ask. He simply nodded, a small, kind smile creasing his weathered face, and walked away. Hesitantly, Alba picked up the camera. It felt solid, real. She raised it to her face, pressing the cold metal against her cheek, and looked through the small glass viewfinder for the first time. And the world changed. The loud, overwhelming chaos of the orphanage courtyard was suddenly contained within a quiet, perfect rectangle. Through that tiny window, she was in control. She could frame a scene, choose what to see, what to focus on. Her eyes, the source of all her shame, were no longer a flaw to be hidden. They were a lens. For the first time in years, she felt not broken, but powerful. Isn't it amazing how a different perspective can change everything? She began to see stories everywhere. The gnarled, work-worn hands of the cook kneading dough, a single stubborn dandelion pushing its way through a crack in the concrete, the lonely silhouette of a younger boy staring out the window, waiting for a family that would never come. These were the moments of quiet suffering and resilient beauty that everyone else ignored. The camera became her voice, a way to speak without making a sound. It was her shield and her weapon. Behind its lens, she could stare directly at the world without fear of the world staring back. She wasn't odd eyes anymore. She was the observer, the archivist of the forgotten. Her first roll of film was a revelation. Julian helped her get it developed, using his own meager savings. When he laid the small, glossy prints out on a table, Alba saw her world captured in stark black and white. She hadn't just taken pictures, she had captured feelings. The profound loneliness in the boy's silhouette, the rough dignity in the cook's hands. Julian looked at the photos, then at her, and his eyes held a look of quiet awe. "You see things, child," he whispered. "You see the truth in things." It was more than a compliment. It was a validation of her very existence. Have you ever had someone say something that made you finally believe in yourself? That small stack of photographs was the first brick in the foundation of a new life. The shame that had lived in her bones for so long began to recede, replaced by a fragile, fluttering thing: purpose. She was still an orphan in a cold, grey building, but she was no longer invisible, at least not to herself. She had a tool to translate her pain into art, her isolation into connection. The world had tried to cast her out for being different, but it had inadvertently given her the very perspective she needed to capture its soul. The spark had been lit. Now, all it needed was air to become a fire. She fell asleep that night, not with the memory of her mother's back, but with the image of a world waiting to be seen through her eyes. The camera became an extension of her own eyes, a second skin. Through its lens, the grey world of the orphanage bloomed with silent, poignant stories that only she could see. For the first time, Alba wasn't the girl to be looked at, but the one who did the looking. Julian's quiet approval was a small, steady flame in the cold draft of her life, but a new light always casts new shadows. The other orphans, who had once ignored her, now watched with a curdled jealousy. Their whispers were no longer just about her witch eyes, but about the old man who favored her, the special object she always carried. It was a dangerous kind of attention. She was different again, and in that place different was always a threat. The attack came without warning in the bleak courtyard. A bigger boy, Marcus, and his followers cornered her against the peeling brick wall. They didn't ask to see her photos. They didn't care about her art. They saw the camera as a symbol of something they didn't have, a judgment on their own invisibility. "Think you're better than us, odd eyes?" Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with resentment. Alba clutched the camera to her chest, her knuckles turning white. It had been her shield, the one thing that made her feel safe. Now, it was the very thing that made her a target. Have you ever felt your greatest strength suddenly become your biggest vulnerability? The struggle was short and ugly. Marcus ripped the camera from her grasp with a vicious tug. For a single, horrifying moment, it seemed to hang suspended in the air, a relic of a future she had just started to believe in. Then it fell, crashing against the unforgiving stone with a sickening crunch of shattering glass and plastic. The sound echoed in the sudden silence, louder than any shout. It was the sound of her new world breaking apart. The boys let out a cruel, triumphant laugh and scattered like rats, leaving Alba on her knees, staring at the wreckage. She didn't make a sound. She just looked at the pieces of her hope, utterly and completely destroyed. The silence that followed was a crushing weight, heavier than any she had known before. Losing the camera meant losing her voice all over again. She retreated into the shell of the little girl who first arrived at Mercy House, but this time it was worse. Beforehand there had been only a numb, hollow ache. Now there was the sharp, bitter memory of a hope that had been violently stolen. The world outside her window became a meaningless blur. She was just Odd Eyes again, the cursed girl who had dared to dream she could be something more. In the twisted logic of her trauma, this felt like a punishment she deserved for trying to escape her fate. At night, the old ghosts returned to haunt her. The image of her mother's back shrinking into the distance played on a relentless loop in her mind, but now it was intercut with the sharp, crystalline sound of the lens shattering on the stone. The two moments of abandonment fused into one terrible, undeniable truth. The world would not tolerate her. Anything beautiful she tried to hold, anything that made her feel whole, would be broken. The shame she had carried for her eyes now spread to her talent, poisoning it. She thought of just stopping the effort, stopping the feeling, stopping the seeing. Have you ever been so defeated that you just wanted to disappear? Her despair was a cloak she pulled so tightly around herself that no one could get in, not even Julian. He found her on her cot, a small, still knot of misery, and sat beside her. His silence was a shared grief. Then he spoke, his voice heavy with a sadness that mirrored her own. He told her he was leaving. His old bones could no longer keep up with the work. The news landed not with a bang, but as a final, quiet crumbling of the last pillar supporting her fragile world. He wasn't abandoning her out of fear or rejection, but it felt the same. The one person who had truly seen her was now walking away. The darkness felt complete. As he stood to leave, Julian pressed a small rectangular object into her palm. It wasn't a camera. It was one of her own photographs, the one of the orphanage cook's gnarled, flour-dusted hands. It was slightly crumpled, a testament to how often he must have looked at it. "They broke the glass," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "But they didn't break this. They can't break what is inside of you, Alba. That vision, that is yours alone." He gently closed her fingers around the photo, a final transfer of belief. Then he was gone. The photograph was a tangible piece of her soul, something the bullies and their hatred couldn't touch. Alba lay in the dark, the photograph a warm square against her cold skin. She couldn't see it, but she could remember every detail, every line, every shadow, every story held within those hands. Julian was right. The camera had just been a box of glass and metal. The real instrument, the real magic was her. It was in her mind, in her heart, in the unique way her eyes of earth and sky processed the world. They had broken the machine, but not the artist. A tiny, defiant spark ignited in the vast emptiness inside her. She fell, but something deep within her refused to stay on the ground. The next morning, Alba walked out of the orphanage gates for the first time without permission. She didn't have a camera, but she had her eyes and a single crumpled photograph. She found the small community arts center Julian had told her about and asked for the teacher. Standing before the woman, she held out the photo of the cook's hands. Her voice, rusty from disuse, was barely a whisper, but her gaze was unwavering. "They broke my camera," she said, her mismatched eyes holding not a trace of shame, but a fierce, quiet resolve. "But I have more pictures to take." It wasn't a question. It was a promise to herself. Would you have found that same strength to rise one more time? If this story touched your heart, imagine how many others are out there waiting to be told. Don't let them fade into silence. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength. Your voice matters. The gallery was a cathedral of light and silence, a universe away from the grey walls of Mercy House. The air hummed with hushed reverence, the scent of wine and potential replacing the old smells of bleach and sorrow. At the center of it all was Alba, now 21. She stood, not with her head bowed, but with a quiet, unshakable poise. Her voice was calm and measured as she spoke to a critic, her hands gesturing toward a large, haunting photograph. The camera flashes that erupted around her were no longer a source of fear, but a chorus of validation. Her mismatched eyes, one of earth, one of sky, were not hidden. They were her trademark, the very lens through which this entire celebrated world had been born. A woman slipped through the grand entrance, a shadow in a worn coat. Out of place amidst the city's art elite, it was Elena. Time had not been kind. It had etched every year of regret into the lines around her mouth and eyes. She moved with the hesitant, shuffling gait of someone who expects to be told they don't belong. A crumpled magazine page in her pocket, showing a familiar pair of eyes, had been her map and her tormentor for the week-long journey. She wasn't seeking forgiveness. She knew she had no right to it. She was simply a moth drawn to the flame of the life she had thrown away, needing to see it for herself. Have you ever been forced to witness the beautiful thing you destroyed? Her gaze was pulled to the walls, and the breath caught in her throat. The photographs were windows into a world she had created and then abandoned. A boy staring from a barred window, his loneliness so palpable it was a physical ache. The gnarled, flour-dusted hands of a cook radiating a rough, weary dignity. A single, defiant dandelion cracking the pavement of a desolate courtyard. It was the poetry of the forgotten, the beauty in the brokenness. Eleanor saw it all with a devastating clarity. The unique vision she had feared, the curse she had run from, was a profound gift of empathy. She hadn't been protecting her daughter from the world's judgment. She had been blinding herself to her daughter's magic. Then, across the room, she saw her. The small, shivering girl from her nightmares was gone. In her place stood a woman, confident, serene, surrounded by people who leaned in to hear her speak. Alba's hair was shorter now, framing a face that had learned to hold its own strength. And her eyes, they were not downcast. They were luminous, engaging, the twin stars around which this entire galaxy of admirers orbited. Elena felt a crushing weight in her chest. The very thing she had deemed a flaw, a reason for exile, was the source of all this light, all this power. The world hadn't cast her daughter out for being different. It had celebrated her. How does it feel to realize your greatest fear was a lie? Driven by a force she couldn't name, Elena began to move through the crowd. Each step was a lifetime. The faces around her were a blur, their polite chatter a distant hum. She was walking toward the epicenter of her life's greatest regret. Alba was laughing, a sound so clear and pure it felt like a judgment. It was the sound of a childhood Elena had stolen, a joy she had no part in creating. The space between them shrank with every agonizing step, yet the 15-year chasm of silence and pain felt deeper than an ocean. She was a ghost walking into her own daughter's brilliant future. What do you say to the person whose life you almost ended before it began? Alba felt a sudden chill, a subtle shift in the room's warm energy. She turned from the conversation, her smile fading as her gaze swept the room and locked onto a face she had only seen in fading memories and recurring nightmares. The world snapped into a tight, silent focus. The gallery, the art, the people, it all dissolved. There stood her mother. The face was older, hollowed out by a sorrow that Alba recognized intimately, for she had worn it herself for years. In that instant, a lifetime of power dynamics was shattered and remade. The frightened child on the steps was gone. The woman who held the entire room in the palm of her hand was here now, and she was the one being looked at with a desperate, pleading hope. They stood frozen for a long moment, a silent, crackling eternity between them. Words were useless, crude instruments for a wound this deep. In Elena's haunted eyes, Alba saw the whole pathetic story. The young widow, the village whispers, the crushing fear that had curdled a mother's love into an act of profound cruelty, and in Alba's calm, unwavering gaze, Elena saw the echo of every cold night, every taunt, every hungry belly, and the fierce, unbreakable will that had survived it all. It was not a look of hate. It was something far more devastating. It was a look of understanding. A look that said, "I see your weakness, and I am no longer defined by it." Could you forgive someone if you finally saw the fear that made them a monster? Alba did not move forward. She offered no comforting gesture, no bridge across the chasm. She simply held her mother's gaze and gave a single, slow nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an invitation. It was a release. It was an acknowledgement of the past and a firm, quiet closing of the door. I see you. I remember. And I am whole without you. With that, she turned her body slightly, back toward the light, back toward the life she had built from the ashes of her abandonment. She chose herself. She chose her art. She chose her future. She left Elena standing alone with the ghost of the little girl she had left behind. Elena watched her daughter turn away, swallowed back into a world of light and admiration that she could never enter. The finality of the gesture was absolute. She was a stranger at the exhibition of her own daughter's soul. The rejection was a sharp, clean pain, a deserved penance for a lifetime of cowardice. She had thrown away a diamond because she was afraid of its unique light. Now, all she could do was stand in the darkness and watch it shine from afar. She had recognized her daughter's worth far, far too late. What about you? Is there someone in your life whose true value you failed to see? The departure of her mother from the gallery was not a victory, but a quiet exhale. It was the sound of a heavy, rusted door finally swinging shut on a long, dark corridor of her past. Alba turned back to the warmth and light of the room, the appreciative murmurs of the crowd a gentle balm on a wound that had just finished scarring over. She didn't feel anger or triumph, only a profound, unshakable peace. The little girl who once stood shivering on the stone steps was finally, truly gone. In her place was an artist who had learned that the most powerful thing you can do with a ghost is to stop running from it and simply let it fade. She had reclaimed her own story, not by erasing the painful beginning, but by writing a brilliant new chapter. Her success was never just for herself. The proceeds from her exhibition, Tale Through Mismatched Eyes, funded the creation of the Julian Project, a foundation dedicated to putting cameras into the hands of forgotten children in orphanages and foster homes. Alba knew that a camera was more than a tool. It was a voice for the voiceless. It was a way to tell the world, I am here, I see things, I matter. She traveled to places that reminded her of Mercy House, not with the dread of a survivor, but with the purpose of a liberator. She sought out the quiet ones, the outcasts, the children who made themselves small to avoid being seen. What would you do if you could turn your deepest pain into someone else's greatest hope? In a brightly lit classroom, a world away from the grey dormitories of her youth, Alba knelt beside a small girl with a nervous tremor in her hands. The girl was struggling to focus an old film camera. Alba didn't take it from her. Instead, she gently guided the child's fingers, her voice a soft murmur of encouragement. See that, she whispered, pointing to a single crack in the wall where a weed was growing. That's a story of survival. It's beautiful because it's strong. You see that? Now, show everyone else. In the girl's eyes, Alba saw a flicker of the same spark that Julian had once ignited in her. She wasn't just teaching photography. She was teaching children how to see their own value. She never saw Eleanor again. Months later, a letter arrived, postmarked from her old village. The handwriting was a spidery, hesitant script filled with words of regret she couldn't bring herself to read fully. She didn't need to. Forgiveness, she had learned, was not about absolving the other person. It was about freeing yourself from the weight of their mistake. She folded the letter and placed it in a box with the broken pieces of her first camera and the mother-of-pearl button. They were artifacts of a life that was no longer hers. She had built her own family, a family of fellow artists, of the children she mentored, of the people who saw her and celebrated her, not in spite of her eyes, but because of them. One evening, standing on the balcony of her small city apartment, Alba looked out at the sprawling tapestry of lights below. She thought of the little girl who used to stare at those same lights through barred windows. Believing they were stars she could never reach, she instinctively touched her face, her fingers tracing the delicate skin around her eyes. The honey one, the blue one, they no longer felt like a brand or a curse. They were her compass, her signature, the twin lenses that had focused her pain into art and her isolation into a profound connection with all of humanity. She was no longer a spectator of life. She was living it, in all its imperfect, breathtaking color. Have you ever learned to love the part of you that you once thought was a flaw? Alba's life became her greatest work of art. Her story was not one of forgetting the past, but of transforming it. The rejection that was meant to break her became the very foundation of her strength. The shame she was taught to feel became the source of her unique empathy. She was rejected by the one who should have loved her most. But in learning to love the part of herself the world called a flaw, she was finally embraced by the world. Her journey is a testament that your beginnings do not have to define your end. The deepest wounds can be healed, not by hiding the scars, but by turning them into a map for others to find their own way home. If this story reminded you that there is strength in what makes you different, please help us share that message. Subscribe to our channel. Give this video a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear that their scars are beautiful. Your support helps us tell more stories that matter.